Hey guys. Tonight, we begin a journey that drifts across time. Not just through one era, but through three stories that seem far apart until they slowly weave together. You'll lie back, let your breath settle, and drift into the nights of medieval Europe, where cold air slips through stone walls, wooden beams creak above. The scent of dry straw mixes with quiet whispers in the dark. You'll pass through ancient Rome, watching a woman, Fulvia, stand in the heart of politics, holding the threads of power men thought only they could touch. And you'll stand in the summer heat of Washington, 1963, hearing "I Have a Dream" echo like a shared heartbeat. This isn't a lecture, and it isn't a fanfare. This is boring history for sleep, the kind a sleepy historian would tell, slow and detailed, just enough to let your mind feel safe enough to wander. If you've been searching for history to fall asleep, or you simply want a quiet backdrop for your night, stay with me. And before you truly settle in, maybe give this video a like, but only if you honestly feel you want to hear more of these kinds of stories. You lie on a bed that is not quite a bed. The straw underneath your shoulder blades gives slightly, but not enough to keep the wooden slats beneath from pressing through. Somewhere in the dark above you, a draft drifts in through a shuttered window, carrying the smell of cold earth and distant smoke. This is the night in a medieval household. It is not silent. Nights in the Middle Ages rarely were, but it has a rhythm that you have never known, one that your own sleep would have to learn. For a medieval villager in Europe, sleep was not the uninterrupted 8-hour stretch that modern life has trained you to expect. It came in two distinct halves, separated by an hour or two of deliberate wakefulness. People called them first sleep and second sleep, phrases as ordinary to them as morning and evening are to you. First sleep would begin not long after sunset, especially in winter when darkness fell early and firewood was too precious to waste on late-night activity. Families would settle into bed under woolen blankets or layers of rough cloth, drifting into the first deep rest of the night. And then, after 3 or 4 hours, they would stir. Not all at once, but one by one, shifting under covers, sitting up, rubbing eyes in the faint glow of embers. The waking was not an accident. It was the schedule. The dark between midnight and dawn was divided by this quiet, intentional pause. It was called the watch, a time to tend to whatever could be done before the second descent into sleep. During this watch, the house did not fill with noise, but it did fill with movement. Someone might coax the hearth back to life, feeding it a few sticks of wood so the cold would not creep too far in before morning. Another might leave the bed entirely to check on livestock, goats or chickens, housed under the same roof or in an attached shed. This was not paranoia, but prudence. In the countryside, a missing animal could mean less milk in the morning, fewer eggs, and a blow to survival. In towns, it could mean theft. There was a social dimension, too. Neighbors, equally awake, might step across a snowy path to share news, exchange goods, or even just talk. A birth in one home, a sick child in another, the return of a traveling son, all could be part of the midnight conversations. Privacy, as modern minds know it, was rare. The thin walls of wattle and daub could not keep voices from carrying. And in those voices, between the breaths of winter air, the night was not something to escape, but something to inhabit. Intimacy, the physical kind, was also said to belong to this hour. Medieval medical texts and marriage guides noted that after the first sleep, the body was refreshed, the mind calm, and arguments of the day had faded into the background. It was the time, according to some, when conception was most likely. And so, in the dim light of a rush lamp, couples might draw closer, not as an impulsive act, but as part of the quiet rhythm of the household. If you imagine this only in the context of Europe, you miss its wider reach. The segmented night, this division of sleep into 2 acts, was not uniquely medieval, nor uniquely Western. Merchants from the Islamic world, traveling the long roads of trade, wrote of similar patterns among rural families in the Maghreb and the Levant. They, too, spoke of a pause between sleep, a time to pray, to stir the coals for tea, to check that the camel ropes had not frayed. In the far villages of Japan, long before the spread of electric light, the same pattern emerged. Farmers would retire soon after dusk and rise again after a few hours, sometimes to do small repairs by the fire, sometimes to talk quietly while the wind pressed against the paper screens. The middle night was an accepted part of life, woven into the fabric of community. Modern science has looked back at this and found something interesting. Without artificial light, human sleep naturally shifts into this segmented pattern. In the 1990s, a series of experiments placed volunteers in darkness for 14 hours each day. After a few weeks, their sleep split into 2 distinct blocks, separated by 1 or 2 hours of calm wakefulness. Their bodies cooled, their hormones adjusted, and their minds entered a state between dream and alertness, a meditative quiet that medieval people would have recognized immediately. That quiet was fertile ground for prayer. Monks and nuns built entire schedules around it. The canonical hours, the fixed points of devotion in the Church's day, included vigils or matins, services held in the deep night. The timing was deliberate. The mind was rested from first sleep, the world was silent, and there was nothing to distract from the words of the Psalms. In monastic dormitories, the bell would ring, sandals would scrape against stone, and the line of robed figures would file into the chapel by candlelight. In a village, the prayers were humbler, but no less important. A whispered Pater Noster, a sign of the cross, a short blessing over sleeping children. For some, the night was a dangerous frontier. Dreams could carry messages from God, but they could also be doorways for the devil. Waking in the middle of the night was not merely an interruption, it was a chance to guard the soul. The watch had its practical uses as well. In a time without clocks, waking in the middle of the night gave a kind of measure to the hours. Travelers could plan their next leg by the stars, bakers could begin kneading dough so that bread would be ready by sunrise, guards could change shifts without rousing the entire garrison. The night was not a solid block to be endured, but a resource to be managed. It is easy to romanticize this, to imagine a rustic charm in the glow of embers, in the gentle conversation between neighbors, in the slow return to sleep. But the reality could be colder, more uncomfortable. Rising from a straw bed in a stone house in January meant meeting air that cut into the lungs. The fire was never quite enough. Your breath would still cloud in front of you. The lamp might flicker out, and you would grope in the dark for a log, fingers stinging from the cold. The quiet between sleeps was not always peaceful. It could be punctured by the cough of a sick child, the cry of a restless animal, or the distant sound of someone moving who should not be. Yet for all that, this rhythm persisted for centuries, because it worked. It matched the slow arc of the seasons, the length of nights, and the demands of daily labor. People rose with the sun, not because they were disciplined, but because there was little else to do in the dark, and little point in fighting the body's own cycle. And so the first sleep would end, the watch would pass, and the second sleep would come. It was often lighter, filled with dreams, and easier to wake from. By the time dawn spread across the thatched rooftops, the household had already been awake once, already tended to some of the day's work, and was ready to begin again. If you were to slip into that world now, to lie down at sunset, to wake in the middle of the night without panic, to move about in the dark without reaching for a switch, you might find that your mind settles differently. You would feel the hours stretch, not in boredom, but in a slow unfolding. You might begin to understand why, for those who lived it, the night was not a single thing to be survived, but a shape to be moved through. And when the second sleep finally came, it was not just rest. It was the completion of a ritual, one that linked you to your household, your neighbors, and to countless others across centuries and continents who moved through their nights in just the same way. And when they woke in the small hours, the space around them was no longer the same night they had entered. It had shifted into something colder, stranger, and far more intimate. If you stepped into a medieval peasant's home, the thing they called a bed might stop you in your tracks. It wasn't the soft, puffy mattress you're used to. No springs, no crisp fabric, no clean white sheets, just a pile of straw, sometimes stuffed inside a coarse sack, sometimes laid bare on the ground or wooden floor. They called it a pallet. A word so humble it barely meant more than what it was. A place to lie down. Straw was used because it was cheap, easy to find, and kept warmth reasonably well through winter. After the harvest, leftover straw was gathered, dried, and either packed into bags or stacked in a corner of the house. If a cloth cover was used, it was often made from hemp or thick linen, coarsely woven on a wooden loom right in the village. Archaeologists have uncovered fragments of linen from 14th century Europe, thick-threaded, fibrous, and loosely woven to save on material. In dim light, the cloth looked gray-brown, the color of soil and ash, not the bright white of modern fabrics. If you were a peasant, that was all you had. Each night you lay down on a bed of straw already crumbling into little pieces, the sweet, damp scent of dried plants blending with the smell of your own body, with the wood smoke clinging to your clothes. When you shifted, the straw gave off a soft rustle, sometimes startling a mouse or a bug into motion. For the slightly better off, straw was still the core, but it was sewn into a sturdier sack, laid atop a wooden frame raised off the ground. This frame kept the bedding dry and helped prevent insects from crawling up through the floorboards. Many archaeological finds from northern Europe and England show bed frames made of oak or pine, joined with wooden pegs and mortise joints. Iron nails were rare and prone to rust. Some frames had slats or crisscrossed ropes beneath the bedding, offering a bit of give. But even with a frame, the feel was far from a modern mattress. The straw compressed unevenly. The places most slept on would sink, while others stayed stiff. After a few weeks, the straw would flatten, grow damp, or begin to smell, forcing the household to replace it or leave it out to dry. Changing straw was hard work. You had to lift the whole sack, pull out the old stuffing, toss it to the animals or to the compost heap, then pack it full again. For the nobility, the story was entirely different. The bed was a symbol of status, a piece of luxury furniture. Large wooden frames, carved with ornamentation, stood tall on 4 posts with draped curtains. The curtains kept warmth in and offered privacy in a room where others might still sleep. Their mattresses were filled with goose feathers, duck down, or fluffed wool. Softer, warmer, and of course, far more expensive. The bedding was white linen, sometimes embroidered at the edges, and the blankets were thick wool or even animal fur. These noble beds were often so high, you needed a stool to climb into them. Historical records and wills from the time show that beds and bed linens were prized possessions, valuable enough to be inherited or given as dowry. Some inventories even listed them in detail. 1 feather bed, 2 linen sheets, 1 woolen coverlet, and a red embroidered canopy. But across all classes, medieval sleep had a common enemy: insects. straw made the perfect home for fleas, lice, and small biting bugs. They hid in the crevices, fed on blood, human and animal, and had no trouble slipping past curtains or fabric. In samples taken from old floorboards and bed frames, scientists have found fossilized flea remains and lice eggs, unmistakable proof that these creatures were constant, unwanted bedfellows. To sleep on straw was to be familiar with the soft itch across your skin, to scratch without waking, then fall back asleep again. When the straw grew damp with sweat or weather, the scent turned stronger, a musty tang, slightly sour, tangled with smoke and the musk of unwashed wool. In winter, when animals were brought indoors to share the space for warmth, their body heat helped cut the cold, but their smells, their fur, multiplied. Night was not quiet. From the straw came the sound of bugs scuttling, mice foraging, and now and then, the pop of someone's joints as they shifted beside you. If you slept in a noble bed, you might be spared the mice, but not the wind shrieking through door cracks, the snap of firewood in the hearth, or the soft tread of servants moving in the dark. To modern ears, the idea of sharing a bed with your entire family, sometimes even strangers, may sound unbearable. But in that world, it was the norm. The peasant's large bed often held parents, children, and possibly a relative or a hired hand. The closeness kept everyone warm during cold seasons and saved space. But it also meant there was no concept of a private bed or personal boundary. Lying there in the middle of the night, you'd feel the warmth of another body beside you, the familiar scent of sweat, the smell of hair and fabric. In the dark, you'd hear steady breathing, the shifting of limbs, and now and then, a dream spoken aloud. It was the rhythm of life together, a blend of all the senses, woven into a single portrait of survival. Even in castles, noble beds were rarely just for two. Besides husband and wife, there might be small children, or a servant sleeping at the foot of the bed, ready to be summoned. In some regions, the bed stood right in the great hall, the same space used for meals and gatherings. Curtains and bedposts were the only walls dividing bedroom from parlor. The feeling of lying down after a long day's labor was different too. There were no sofas, no soft chairs to lounge in during daylight hours. The bed was the only place where your body could finally let go. As you stretched out on the straw, your spine registered every lump, every uneven patch, but your tired limbs found their release. The rustle of straw joined with the wind outside the thatched roof, and you knew that, at least for a few hours, your body could rest. These straw beds, rough, imperfect, lived in Europe's collective memory for centuries. They weren't just objects. They were part of life, marked by smells, by sound, by feeling, echoes of an entire era. And then, as you drift off on that bed of straw, the tiny sounds, the shifting bugs, the quiet breath of the one beside you become your lullaby. Imagine yourself lying on a straw pallet in a stone house somewhere in medieval Europe. Night wind hisses through the cracks in the door, each gust slipping deep into your spine. You pull the worn wool blanket higher, but your head and ears still sting with cold. That's why a small, seemingly trivial item became something many people wouldn't sleep without: the nightcap. Medieval nightcaps weren't the cute accessories you see in modern Christmas illustrations. They were survival gear. Made from thick wool, linen, or hemp, these caps covered the entire head, sometimes even the ears, preserving the precious warmth that escapes fastest from the body. Houses back then had little to no insulation. Thatched roofs and stone walls absorbed the winter cold and exhaled damp air in spring. At night, the temperature inside was only a few degrees warmer than outside, and that chill was a constant companion for months. The most common style was a long, pointed cap that sometimes hung to one shoulder, warming the head and acting as a makeshift scarf wrapped around the neck. They were often made from stitched-together scraps of leftover fabric, making use of whatever material was available. Peasants wore simple, undyed versions sewn tightly to endure many winters. For the wealthy, a nightcap might be trimmed with fur or embroidered with colored thread at the edges, a quiet display of comfort, even in sleep. Alongside the cap came the nightshirt, a long, loose garment made from linen or light wool, falling to the knees or ankles. It provided warmth and protected the skin from direct contact with scratchy wool, coarse straw, or itchy animal fur blankets. In 14th century illustrations, men are often shown in plain white nightshirts, while women sometimes wore an extra thin underdress for added warmth. These clothes weren't made to impress. They were practical, wide for movement, beltless to allow blood to circulate freely during rest. Compared to ancient Rome, the habit of covering one's head during sleep wasn't new. The Romans, especially the upper class, wore the pileus, a soft fabric cap, while resting, not only for warmth, but as a symbol of privacy. In the Mediterranean climate, it was less about cold, more about keeping hair and scalp clean and marking the boundary between public and private life. A signal: I am indoors now. By the Renaissance, architecture had improved somewhat, but rooms still weren't warm. The nightcap became a familiar presence in urban households. In the 15th to 16th century Italy and France, paintings sometimes showed the sick lying in bed, head fully covered, as a symbol of care. Nightcaps of this period could be made of silk or soft cotton, dyed pale colors, edged in lace, still functional, but also a sign that the wearer could afford more than coarse cloth. Beyond the cold, covering the head while sleeping was tied to social and religious expectations. In many communities, especially where Christianity held strong, married women were expected to keep their hair covered around others, even within extended families or when guests stayed overnight. So a nightcap or headscarf wasn't just about warmth, it signified modesty. Even in a shared bedroom, a woman's hair remained hidden, an act of quiet devotion to the norms of her world. For men, the cap didn't carry religious weight, but it still held social meaning. In some towns, wearing a nightcap when answering a door at night was a polite way to say you weren't available. One 15th century account describes a merchant who answered a midnight knock in his nightshirt and long cap, then declined a deal with the phrase, "I've laid down my day cap," a pun implying that business was done for the night. In monasteries, the nightcap and nightshirt were part of strict routines. Monks wore robes or tunics even while sleeping, sometimes with a simple wool cap or headcloth, not just for warmth, but as a reminder. Humility never sleeps. They had to be ready for prayer at any hour. Night in a monastery could be broken by the bells for matins, and no one was to stand before the altar bareheaded unless required. But even with all those layers, the cold remained. Stone walls, though thick, held moisture. By day, they absorbed the chill of shaded courtyards. By night, they gave that cold back to the room. Without a fire, the house became a stone box that breathed frost. In the darkness, as you tug your cap low and wrap your nightshirt tighter, the wind sweeping across the wall and under the door sounds like a warning. Out there is a harsh world. In here, only a fragile pocket of warmth. Slipping into bed with cap and nightshirt was a mix of relief and discomfort. Relief as warmth began to gather around your shoulders and head. Discomfort because wool or hemp could itch against the skin, and the cap might shift when you turned in your sleep. On long winter nights, the cap might be slightly damp by morning from your breath, leaving a warm, faintly sweet scent of wool that had soaked up the air. To modern eyes, the nightcap might seem quaint, a fairy tale detail, worn by Santa Claus or characters from children's books. But to medieval people, it was the first line of defense against long nights and creeping cold. It was also a cultural curtain, hiding not just hair and ears, but the line between self and others, body and gaze. And when you finally pull the cap down over your brow, wrap the shirt close, the warmth slowly spreads, pushing back against the chill rising from stone walls, creeping through floorboards, whistling under doors. Outside, the wind still howls. Inside, you hear the rustle of fabric as the person beside you shifts, and realize that in this darkness, all that stands between you and the cold is a few layers of thread, a little shared body heat, and the quiet habits passed down through generations. And as you drift off to sleep, the stone walls remain, silent and unmoved, just as they have stood for centuries. If you were a pilgrim in medieval Europe, once darkness began to fall, the most urgent question wasn't what you'd eat for dinner, but where you'd sleep. The road stretched ahead, flanked by forests on either side, and far in the distance, a faint light flickered from a town. Your best hope of finding an inn. The word inn might conjure warm images, like the cozy taverns in fairy tales, glowing hearths, and the scent of fresh bread. But the reality, back then, was often far less romantic. In small towns, an inn was usually just a two-story building made of rough wood or stone. The lower level housed a tavern and kitchen. Upstairs was where the travelers slept. There was no concept of private rooms as we know them today, and you weren't paying for a bed of your own. You paid for a spot on a bed, and that bed almost certainly already had someone in it. In the 14th century pilgrimage journal of an Italian merchant named Niccolò da Poggibonsi, he recalled, "I arrived at an inn in Canterbury and was shown to a large bed already occupied by 2 men. The innkeeper said, 'If you want a private bed, you'll have to pay double and sleep with the rats in the grain loft. Here, beds are shared. First come, first served.' Sharing a bed with strangers wasn't considered rude. It was simply an efficient use of resources. Beds and blankets were expensive, costly to maintain, so the innkeeper maximized what was available. A double bed could hold 2, 3, even 4 guests, depending on its size and their tolerance. In larger cities or popular pilgrimage sites like Santiago de Compostela or Rome, an inn might accommodate dozens of guests a night. Beds were lined up closely, separated only by a plank of wood or a thin curtain. The sounds of snoring, tossing, and muttered dreams blended together. The air held the scent of unwashed bodies, damp wool, and spilled wine from supper, a heavy mixture that clung to the room and crept into your sleep. Some inns had written rules for dividing guests, at least on paper. Noblemen or wealthy merchants were placed together, both to help them feel secure and to avoid conflict with poorer travelers. Pilgrims typically shared beds with members of their travel group. Craftsmen, soldiers, or small traders were paired wherever space was left. In some places, men and women were separated, but not always. Especially in busy towns, demand often outstripped the supply of beds. There are colorful accounts in the travel writings of Marjorie Kemp, an English pilgrim from the early 15th century. She once complained that at an inn in Calais, she had to share a bed with a complete stranger, and a girl whose breath stank of wine. Kempe described it as a night long as Lent, where she barely slept, worried her belongings might be stolen. Personal safety and protection of one's belongings were major concerns. Travelers often carried everything with them: money, clothing, tools, sometimes even trade goods. To fall asleep in a room full of strangers was an open invitation to thieves. There were no safes, no locks. Instead, people developed their own methods. Tie your money pouch to your belt and wear it to bed. Some even stitched the pouch into the inner layer of clothing, so no one could reach it without touching skin. Use your belongings as a pillow. Wrap your clothes or satchel under your head so your valuables stay close. Hide small valuables in your shoes, coins or jewelry tucked in the toe, then placed under the blanket or your feet while you slept. Sleep with your back to the wall, a spot that reduced the chance of being bumped or approached from behind. In larger city inns, some even hired night guards, usually strong servants who walked between beds to prevent fights or theft. Still, losses happened. There was an old saying, "He who sleeps at an inn wakes a penny lighter," meaning you were bound to lose something, even if just a handkerchief. Yet inns weren't just places to rest. They were centers of exchange, of stories, of news, of possibility. Travelers heard tales from distant regions, caught up on rumors from merchants, or found companions for the next leg of the journey. The night in the inn, though crowded and noisy, was also a moment of belonging, a pause in the long, shifting map of the road. The feeling of climbing into a shared bed with strangers was a mix of unease, caution, and, at times, comfort. Comfort in not being alone, caution because any of them could be a thief, or simply a restless sleeper. The blanket, if there was one, had to be shared. You pulled a bit toward yourself, felt the other person pull back. Their breath hit the back of your neck, still carrying the scent of wine or garlic from dinner. In the dark, the lines between self and others blurred. You became part of a temporary collective, strangers linked by shared sleep, shared warmth, and the fragile silence between nighttime sounds. And when the church bells rang, or the rooster crowed, everyone rose, packed their things, and each walked off in a different direction, never to meet again. And in that moment, leaving the inn behind, you understood that last night had been more than just sleep. It had been a lesson in trust. And sometimes, trust had to be given to complete strangers. You've climbed into bed. Nightcap pulled low, nightshirt drawn close. The room is lit only by the soft flicker of a dying oil lamp. In the cold, seeping through the stone walls, a familiar ritual begins, not to fall asleep, but to prepare for it. In medieval Europe, sleep wasn't just rest. It was a dangerous emptiness, a blurred threshold between life and death, between light and shadow. It was believed that in sleep, the soul might leave the body. And if it did, who could promise it would return? So prayer before bed became a habit that no one skipped. Simple lines like the Pater Noster or Ave Maria were repeated quietly, soft as breath. Children were taught rhyming verses. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. To modern ears, it may sound innocent, but to medieval minds, it was a true spiritual contract, a brief will, entrusting the soul before entering the realm of dreams. The fear of sudden death hung in every household. Illness didn't announce itself. A fever in the night could take someone before dawn. Fire, collapsing roofs, robbery, or simply a heart that stopped. These things happened. And plague, or typhoid, or sweating sickness made people believe that sleep was the hour demons struck, when the body was defenseless and the spirit unguarded. The clergy, attuned to this fear, shaped the ritual of Compline, the final prayer of the day. In churches and monasteries, the chant rose under candlelight, pleading for protection through the night. After Compline, a vow of silence was kept until morning, as if even speech might stir something in the dark. Dreams, to the medieval mind, weren't just scraps of memory or imagination. They were messages, and depending on their nature, they could come from God, from saints, or from the devil himself. Medical manuscripts of the time classified dreams like symptoms. To dream of water might signal weakness in the kidneys. To dream of fire, a sign of fever. Physicians drew on Greek knowledge, from Galen, from Artemidorus, decoding dreams as maps of the body's condition. In theology, dreams were battlefields of the soul. St. Augustine once wrote that even sinful dreams, though not willed, could reveal a weakened spirit. Many would wake in the night, distressed, and seek confession, fearing that if they died now, judgment would come for what they had dreamed. Some dreams were recorded and passed down as revelations. A monk might dream of the Virgin Mary warning of drought. A pilgrim might see a patron saint offering direction. But there were other dreams, temptations cloaked in beauty, visions that stirred doubt or desire, or the breaking of sacred vows. People sought to ready their minds before bed to avoid such visions. No overeating, no strong drink, no cruel words. These were the repeated instructions in books of health and moral conduct. Some hung a crucifix above the bed. Others placed relics beneath the pillow, believing they would filter the dreamscape of demonic influence. And this was not unique to Europe. In the Islamic world, medieval scholars and pilgrims also kept rituals before sleep. The Ayat al-Kursi, a verse from the Quran, was recited as a shield against nighttime disturbance by jinn, spiritual beings. Sufi mystics practiced zikr, the repeated naming of God, until sleep overtook them, so that even in unconsciousness, their connection remained unbroken. In East Asia, especially within Confucian, Buddhist, and Taoist traditions, sleep, too, was a spiritual and medical domain. In Chinese medical texts, dreams reflected the movements of qi, balanced through yin and yang, fire and water. To dream of water meant an excess of cold energy. To dream of fire, too much heat. Buddhist monks would recite short sutras before sleep, not just for protection, but to guide the heart toward clarity and avoid restless, harmful dreams. In medieval Japan, samurai kept their swords within reach and recited a brief waka poem before sleep, a final message to the world in case they didn't wake again. In every culture, these rituals reflect a shared truth. Sleep is a departure from the safe harbor of waking thought. And every journey into the unknown needs a talisman, whether a prayer, a sacred symbol, or a whispered farewell. And now you lie there, eyes beginning to close. The oil lamp dwindles to a pinprick, then goes out. Everything changes. The sounds of the day vanish. Now, there is only the breath of the person beside you, the wind brushing the roof, the quiet rustle of straw beneath your spine. In this darkness, your mind begins to drift, to a place beyond control, beyond certainty. To the medieval soul, this moment was both sacred and terrifying. Sacred, for it opened a gate toward divinity. Terrifying, because it might invite demons in. And no one knew whether they would awaken with their soul intact or carry some invisible scratch from the other side of sleep. And then, just as your eyes close, the world begins to hand you off to another time. Around the year 83 BCE, Rome was no longer the serene city of white marble you might picture from postcards or statues. It was a hive, loud, crowded, and dusty, where political power was brokered not just in Senate sessions, but in dinner banquets, public funerals, and murmured conversations beside tavern counters. Fulvia was born right in the heart of that, a city trembling beneath the political earthquakes of the late Roman Republic. Her family, the Fulvi, were not among the ancient patrician clans who had ruled since the founding of the Republic, but they belonged to the elite plebeian class, commoner families who had climbed the political ladder over generations. The Fulvi had produced consuls and generals, and while they didn't hold unshakable power like the patrician dynasties, they had built reputation and networks with enough finesse to become a force to reckon with. Fulvia's father, Marcus Fulvius Bambalio, was remembered by his nickname, Bambalio, meaning stammerer. The name offered a glimpse into his nature. Not a powerful orator, not a man who could silence a crowd. But in Roman society, wealth, marriages, and lineage could make up for what one lacked in rhetoric. Fulvia's mother, as with most women of the time, was barely recorded in historical texts. But it's likely she came from a family of standing, bolstering political alliances through marriage ties. Fulvia's childhood unfolded inside wide domus houses, floors laid with mosaic stone, sunlight pouring into atriums, the sound of trickling water from an impluvium. These homes weren't just dwellings. They were stages for social theater, where hosts entertained, lobbied, and displayed their wealth in frescoes, statues, and silverware. In that atmosphere, a child like Fulvia couldn't help but witness the quiet power of conversations, where a soft phrase might sway a law or cement a military pact. Beyond the Fulvia household, Rome in the 80s BCE was in turmoil. Sulla had just carried out his brutal reforms, posting bounties on political rivals, issuing prescriptions, public kill lists that drove families into hiding or stripped them of everything. Wars in distant provinces, from Hispania to the east, bled the treasury dry, while victorious legions returned with spoils and ambition. For elite Roman women, the path ahead was clearly drawn. To become a respectable matrona, to manage the household, bear heirs, and support their husband's political career through indirect means. The law forbade women from holding office or voting, but it did not forbid them from influencing. In practice, Roman noblewomen, through marriage, inheritance, and social ties, could exert deep influence over the political sphere. Fulvia came of age straddling two worlds. On one side, she absorbed the ideals of the matrona, upholding family honor, observing religious rites, always appearing with the proper bearing. On the other, she watched powerful women like Clodia Metelli or Servilia, mother of Brutus, women who used intellect and relationships to shape the fates of the men around them. Her daily rhythm as a girl reflected her station. In the morning, the family would receive male visitors in the atrium. Fulvia and the women would watch discreetly from separate quarters or behind open passages, learning to read who was an ally, who a rival. Midday, she might attend religious rites for women, rituals for Vesta or Bona Dea, sacred ceremonies that were also social gatherings for the city's powerful families. In the afternoon, she learned to manage slaves, supervise the kitchen, and, in more progressive households, read and write Latin and Greek, with access to literature and history. But perhaps more important than any lesson was the political atmosphere that soaked through everything. Life in Rome was an unbroken procession of speeches in the Forum, triumphal parades, and public trials where careers could be destroyed in a morning. Each event was a lesson to an observant girl, how a narrative could elevate or ruin someone, how a gift or a dinner invitation could bind loyalty like chains. Fulvia did not grow up believing Rome was fair or stable. From an early age, she saw that shifting tides of power could wipe out entire families. To survive, even to rise, required the ability to read people, to seize the moment, and the courage to act when the time came. In this cradle of power and intrigue, a young Fulvia began shaping her identity, not merely as the daughter of a noble house, but as a person of will, aware that the world wasn't made for those who stood quietly at its edges. What she learned in her girlhood about roles, limits, and the loopholes written into the laws that governed women would become the tools she carried for life. And one day, she would use them to step out from the shadows of men and walk directly into the heart of Rome's political storm. By the time Fulvia reached adulthood, Rome was deep in political chaos and bitter division. This was a time when politicians didn't just battle in speeches at the forum, they fought with street gangs in the alleyways. And in the midst of it all, Fulvia married one of the most controversial and influential figures of the age, Publius Clodius Pulcher. Clodius came from a noble patrician family, but he took an unusual path. To be elected tribune of the plebs, an office reserved for commoners, he made a bold move. He renounced his patrician status and was legally adopted into the plebeian class. It was rare, but legal, and it was clever. As tribune, Clodius gained the power to veto Senate decisions and introduce laws that favored, or flattered, the urban poor. Fulvia, born into an elite plebeian family, made the perfect political match. This marriage wasn't just two individuals, it was the union of two networks, the Fulvi's wealth and reputation, and Clodius's mastery of public influence. From the beginning, Fulvia was more than a wife in the shadows. In the sharp, often mocking accounts of Cicero, biased but revealing, we catch glimpses of a political partner, welcoming allies into their home, attending public gatherings, and appearing in spaces Roman women rarely entered openly. Fulvia understood that Clodius's politics didn't happen in solemn chambers, but in the streets, in the chants of the poor, and sometimes in the chaos of fists and flying stones. Clodius soon became the face of Rome's populist movement. He passed laws for free grain distributions, cut back the powers of elite councils, and protected collegia, the street guilds that were his political muscle. But his rise made him enemies, most notably Titus Annius Milo, a rival politician with street gangs of his own. On January 18th, 52 BCE, that rivalry reached its breaking point. On the Appian Way, the entourages of Clodius and Milo crossed paths. Words were exchanged, then stones, then blood. Clodius was wounded and taken to a nearby inn. Milo seized the moment and ordered him killed on the spot. News of Clodius's death swept through Rome like fire. The crowds who once cheered for him were furious. But it wasn't until Fulvia stepped forward that the anger turned into a political storm. Barely in her 20s, now a widow, Fulvia did not mourn in silence. She turned the funeral into a public reckoning. Clodius's body, still bearing its wounds, was laid out in the family home on the Palatine Hill. Fulvia opened the atrium to all of Rome. According to Asconius, she made no effort to hide the stab wounds or the blood, letting the people see exactly what had been done. On the day of the funeral, Rome's streets overflowed. From the poor neighborhoods of Subura to the city's outskirts, they came, weeping, shouting, demanding justice. Fulvia led the procession, dressed in dark robes, hair unbound, cradling her husband's portrait. She gave no speech. That was the role of men in Roman custom. But her silence, her gaze, said everything. When the bier reached the Forum Romanum, the crowd could no longer be contained. Ancient sources say that it was during the funeral that the mob rioted, setting fire to Clodius's pyre, using the platform of the Curia Hostilia, the old Senate house, as kindling. The flames spread. Buildings nearby caught fire. What began as a farewell became an urban crisis. For Fulvia, it wasn't just a funeral, it was a move on the political board. She turned her husband's death into living proof of the violence of his enemies. She recast Clodius as a martyr, a man who died for the people. To his opponents, Fulvia became dangerous. Not only did she mourn, she knew how to turn grief into a rallying cry. After the funeral, Rome grew even more unstable. Milo was tried and exiled. Clodius's supporters rioted on, and Fulvia's name stayed tied to that moment, the day a woman stood at the center of a populist explosion where crowd emotion and political force became one. From that point on, Fulvia was no longer simply Clodius's wife. She was a political figure in her own right, one of the rare Roman women recognized by the public, not for her family, but for her actions. And she was only just beginning. As the smoke cleared from the chaos following Clodius's death, Rome still reeked of unrest and violence. Fulvia, now a young widow known across the city, stood at a crossroads. She had already proven her ability to stir the emotions of the crowd. But the power of a widow, however fierce, could fade unless tied to a new alliance. That alliance came in the form of Gaius Scribonius Curio, a witty, aristocratic young man, well known for his speeches at the Forum, and more importantly, a rising figure caught in the vortex between Julius Caesar and the conservative Senate. Curio was no newcomer. He had a reputation for indulgence, parties, and shifting loyalties. But by the late 50s BCE, Curio began leaning toward Caesar, not merely as a tactic, but because he understood something. In Rome, standing beside a likely victor could open doors nothing else could. For Fulvia, marrying Curio was a strategic move. She stepped out from the legacy of a street-born populist movement and into the heart of Rome's national power struggle, where the fate of the Republic itself was being rewritten. No longer among collegia and the chants of Subura, she now stood in a wider web of generals, orators, and provincial wealth caught in the tug-of-war between Caesar and Pompey. The home she shared with Curio became a meeting ground for Caesar's allies in Rome. There, messages from the Gallic front were exchanged, land laws debated, and every counter-move of the Optimates in the Senate closely tracked. As with Clodius before, Fulvia did not remain on the sidelines. She welcomed guests, studied their expressions, and learned how to hear the difference between a genuine promise and a probing courtesy. When Curio became tribune of the plebs in 50 BCE, he held one of the keys to Rome's future. Fulvia knew just how critical that role could be. She had lived it, seen how a tribune could ignite or extinguish a movement. And now, Curio stood before that same flame. Only this time, the stakes were not just political, but civil war. Once unsteady in his convictions, Curio now stood firm, calling on the Senate to require both Caesar and Pompey to disband their armies in order to avoid civil conflict. It sounded fair, but it was a strategy designed to strip Pompey of advantage while Caesar kept his legions intact. Fulvia followed the tense Senate debates from a distance, receiving updates each evening from the allies who passed through her doors. Then came the moment history would remember. In early 49 BCE, Caesar crossed the Rubicon, and civil war began. Curio did not hesitate. He chose Caesar. So did Fulvia, not as a soldier, but as someone who understood that in Rome, loyalty was the rarest currency once war broke out. Curio was ordered to lead forces to Sicily, then across to Africa to confront Pompey's allies there. Fulvia stayed behind. She saw him off like so many Roman women had before, on the banks of the Tiber, watching the warships depart, the shouts of sailors blending with the clatter of armor. Curio, in polished breastplate, turned to wave. Fulvia waved back, not knowing it would be the last time she saw him alive. In the months that followed, news from Africa reached Rome slowly and unevenly. She heard that Curio had taken Utica, then dared to challenge King Juba I of Numidia. But ambition and haste led him into a trap. In August of 49 BCE, at the Battle of the Bagradus River, Curio's forces were overwhelmed by the Numidian army. According to Plutarch, he fought to the end, refusing to flee even as friends begged him to run, and was killed in the field. The news reached Rome like a cold knife. No body was returned, only stories from survivors, that Curio had fallen in the middle of the circle, and his army had been almost entirely destroyed. Fulvia became a widow again, and once more, not from old age or illness, but from political violence. But unlike Clodius's death, Curios fell far away. There was no public funeral to turn into protest, no Roman crowd to rally into outrage. There was only silence, unanswered letters, and an empty space in a house once full of talk about Caesar's campaigns. The loss left a deep mark on Fulvia. More than ever, she understood that in Rome, power always walked beside the threat of total ruin. But it also made her harder. She did not retreat into private life, as so many widows did. Instead, Fulvia maintained her political connections, laying the groundwork for her next alliance. One that would take her higher than ever before and place her in the center of a civil war even bloodier than any Curio had known. When Julius Caesar was assassinated in March of 44 BCE, it was as if Rome had been split open by an invisible blade. The air thickened with rumors, grudges, and the chilling sense that the old rules of the Republic had been torn apart. In the vacuum that followed, new names began to rise. Among them, Marcus Antonius, or Mark Antony. Antony had been one of Caesar's closest allies, a general, a loyal commander, and a deeply polarizing figure. He was admired for his generosity, known for sharing wealth and land with his soldiers. But he was also mocked for his indulgent lifestyle, his taste for parties, and his staggering debts. For Fulvia, Antony wasn't just a powerful man. He was a door, one that opened into the very heart of a network no Roman woman had ever stood inside, let alone helped direct. Their marriage took place against a backdrop of chaos. With Caesar dead, Antony fought to consolidate power, facing off not only against the assassins, but against rising stars like Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and political heir. Fulvia, twice widowed, entered this union not as a woman seeking protection, but as a political partner. An equal. Accounts from Appian and Cassius Dio, often hostile to women in politics, still reveal Fulvia as more than a wife behind the curtain. She read Antony's letters, received guests in his absence, and made decisions in matters traditionally reserved for men. While Antony campaigned and negotiated across provinces, Rome was Fulvia's to hold. Unofficially, she served as his regent in the capital. She managed political favors, appointing minor officials, distributing land to veterans. In Rome, these were the real currency of influence, and Fulvia knew how to spend it. In the mornings at the Forum Romanum, as messengers and officials arrived from across Italy, those seeking Antony's favor often came first to Fulvia's home. She met them in the broad atrium, flanked by secretaries recording every request, a debt to erase, a letter of recommendation, a patron for a legal dispute. She didn't grant everything, but if she helped you, you remembered. Fulvia also kept close ties with Antony's base of power, his veterans. Soldiers who had served under Caesar and Antony often gathered in Rome after discharge. She ensured they received their promised land, or at least a firm assurance that Antony would deliver. On festival days, she hosted feasts, handed out gifts, tokens of loyalty in an increasingly unpredictable world. But Fulvia's role wasn't limited to favors and feasts. As tensions between Antony and Octavian deepened, she recognized the threat. She saw what many refused to admit, that these two men could not share power forever. While Antony was in the east, Fulvia became the linchpin holding his faction together in Rome, fighting to block the rising tide of Octavian's influence. The capital became a chessboard. Octavian, with the support of Rome's younger crowds and part of the Senate, expanded his reach. The conservatives schemed quietly to revive fragments of the old republic. And Fulvia, in Antony's name, tried to keep allies from defecting while resisting Octavian's every advance. At times, she operated more like a strategist than a spouse. She sent letters to provincial commanders, issued instructions to military officers in Italy, and intervened in land disputes between Antony's veterans and local communities, conflicts that could easily spiral into riots. Even the biased ancient sources admit Fulvia didn't shy away from confrontation. Cassius Dio wrote of her refusing an audience with an Octavian delegation, saying that Antony was away and all matters would be resolved when he returned. A polite delay and a firm reminder. She held the gate. Fulvia's power was real. But it was also personal. Antony, despite his chaotic private life, seemed to trust Fulvia more deeply than most. Fragments of letters, preserved only in political jabs by rivals, hint at a blend of affection and logistical coordination. She didn't just ask where he was. She reminded him of appointments, unsettled debts, and the temperature of Rome's politics. When Antony left Italy for his eastern campaigns, Fulvia became the foundation of his faction. But with that power came risk. Octavian couldn't directly attack Antony in his absence, but he could isolate Fulvia. Cut her off, undermine her authority before Antony returned. And that marked the beginning of a chain of events that would draw Fulvia into direct confrontation with Caesar's young heir. A confrontation that would not end in letters or laws, but in war. While Antony remained in the east, consolidating his power and chasing ambition across distant lands, Italy was becoming increasingly ungovernable. Octavian Young, less experienced but sharp and persistent, steadily expanded his influence. He wielded the name of Caesar's heir like a sword, rallying soldiers and citizens alike, and enacted a program of land redistribution for veterans, often clashing with local communities forced to surrender their property. Fulvia saw this not as a matter of logistics, but as a battle for survival. The fight to preserve Antony's standing. The situation had become so tense that in her letters to Antony, she not only reported the political developments in Rome, but urged him to return, or at the very least, grant her leave to act decisively. According to Cassius Dio and Appian, the rift between Fulvia and Octavian had grown irreparable. She did not see him as merely a political rival, but as a traitor to Caesar's legacy, exploiting that name for personal gain. When words no longer sufficed, Fulvia chose another path, the path of war. She turned to Lucius Antonius, Antony's brother, and, at the time, consul of the Republic. Though Lucius lacked military brilliance, he was the legitimate representative of the Antonian faction in Rome. With Fulvia pulling the strings behind the scenes, they began to assemble forces, drawing on the resentment of veterans and displaced citizens as kindling. The declared aim was to protect Antony's interests and defend those harmed by Octavian's land policies. Beneath the rhetoric, however, lay a direct challenge to Octavian's authority in Italy, an attempt to force a power-sharing agreement or to drive him back. In late 41 BCE, Fulvia and Lucius mobilized 8 legions and moved into the city of Perugia, modern Perugia, a strategically vital position in central Italy. Thus began the Perusine War. But Octavian moved faster than they anticipated. He encircled Perugia with a larger army, severing supply lines and constructing siege works to lock down the city through the winter. What followed were months of hardship, bitter cold, dwindling rations, and sinking morale. Inside the besieged city, Fulvia did not stay hidden. Accounts, perhaps dramatized, describe her walking through the camps, rousing the troops, even discussing tactics with commanders. But willpower could not hold off hunger. Supplies ran out, disease spread. No reinforcements came from Antony. By early 40 BCE, the situation was unsalvageable. Lucius Antonius surrendered. Octavian, perhaps to avoid provoking Antony into immediate retaliation, spared both Lucius and Fulvia, but exiled them from Italy. Fulvia was sent to Sicyon, a city in Greece. From the heart of Roman power, she had fallen into exile far from family, far from the intricate networks she had so carefully cultivated. Rumors buzzed about the reason for her downfall. Some blamed Lucius. Others accused Fulvia of being too ambitious, too meddlesome. Much of it was manufactured by rivals, but still enough to erode her standing. In Sicyon, Fulvia waited for Antony, but he did not rush to her. By then, he had begun a political and romantic entanglement with Cleopatra in Egypt, a union that widened the chasm between him and Fulvia. Some ancient sources hint that Antony was angered she had launched the war without his order. Others imply he remained silent because he was laying groundwork for a new alliance with Octavian. Whatever the reason, Fulvia was left alone. Her health deteriorated rapidly, perhaps from stress, illness, or both. By mid-40 BCE, Fulvia died in Sicyon, aged around 43. No state funeral in Rome. No throngs of mourners like at Clodius's passing. Just a quiet death, far from home, leaving a void in the story of women who dared to challenge Rome's political order. Her death cleared the path for a temporary reconciliation between Antony and Octavian, sealed by Antony's marriage to Octavia, Octavian's sister. In this new chapter, Fulvia's name was rarely mentioned. But looking back, her mark is unmistakable. From a young woman of the Fulvian house, she lived through 3 marriages to 3 major political figures, played active roles in mass movements, and led a war, an unprecedented act for a Roman woman. Her story ends in a foreign city, but her legacy of boldness, of how a woman might bend and challenge the mechanisms of power, remains, buried in the silences of history, awaiting those who listen. Her tale concluded, yet the world spun on. Summer mornings in early 1960s, America often began with the hum of the kitchen radio, short news bulletins, and the steady cadence of a broadcast voice. But in those years, the news rarely brought comfort. The Cold War still stretched taut like a drawn wire. In the South, Jim Crow laws bound the lives of millions of Black Americans into a century-old order of racial segregation. Even in the North, where laws were less overtly discriminatory, invisible boundaries of housing, employment, and education still held everything apart. If you switched on the radio on a morning in 1963, somewhere between a Sam Cooke ballad or a Motown track, you might hear about a church bombing in Alabama, an arrest in Mississippi, or police unleashing fire hoses on student protesters in Birmingham. The soundtrack of the era was a strange blend of hopeful song and the noise of injustice. These tensions weren't new, but by the early 1960s, they had reached a boiling point. America stood at a crossroads. One path led toward sweeping change, the other clung to the status quo at any cost. The civil rights movement had already been marching for more than a decade, from the historic legal victory of Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which declared segregated public schools unconstitutional, to Rosa Parks' brave defiance on a Montgomery bus in 1955 that sparked a year-long boycott. Each act was a paving stone, stretching from small southern neighborhoods to the heart of national politics. But even with progress on paper, life on the ground told a different story. In many southern towns, Black citizens were still denied the right to vote through poll taxes and literacy tests. In northern states, they were still denied housing in many neighborhoods or trapped in low-wage jobs with little hope for advancement. Change wasn't driven solely by court rulings. It marched in footsteps through the streets. Black and white students staged sit-ins at whites-only lunch counters. Freedom riders, young men and women rode interstate buses, deliberately sitting side by side to defy segregation laws. And in Birmingham, in 1963, thousands of schoolchildren walked out of class to join demonstrations, only to be jailed and met with police hoses. The smoke from those clashes hadn't yet cleared when the idea of a large march on Washington began to form again. In fact, the March on Washington wasn't a new concept. In the 1940s, A. Philip Randolph, a powerful labor leader, had threatened such a march to protest discrimination in the defense industry. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, under pressure, issued an executive order banning such discrimination, and the march was called off. But now was a different time. Half measures and promises were no longer enough. Leaders of the civil rights movement, from Martin Luther King Jr. of the SCLC and John Lewis of SNCCC to Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, understood that only a national jolt could push the stalled civil rights legislation in Congress forward. The idea solidified quickly. The march would not be just for voting rights or against segregation, but for jobs and freedom. The message was clear. Civil rights and economic rights must go hand in hand. There could be no true equality if Black Americans were shut out of good jobs and trapped in poverty. When news of the march spread, its sound stood apart from the daily din of injustice. In Southern churches, pastors announced it from the pulpit, and the congregation echoed with "Amen." In northern neighborhoods, flyers were passed hand to hand in grocery stores, barber shops, and factory floors. The talk buzzed. Who's going? How will we get there? How much money should we bring? Who will watch the kids? Who will watch the house? The federal government grew anxious. President John F. Kennedy, though supportive of a new civil rights bill, feared that a massive gathering could spiral into chaos and jeopardize wavering congressional support. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, closely monitored organizers, tapped phones, and infiltrated planning groups with agents. But amid all the worry, determination only grew. The date was set. August 28, 1963. The location, the National Mall in Washington, D.C., with the Lincoln Memorial as the focal point, a symbol of emancipation. From that moment, the road to Washington was no longer just metaphorical. It became a real journey. Buses were chartered from small towns across Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. In the north, special trains were reserved to carry thousands from New York, Philadelphia, Chicago. Many people had never left their state, never seen the nation's capital. The sound of this journey was the hum of engines, the singing of passengers' hymns, freedom songs like "We Shall Overcome." The smell of packed lunches, fried chicken, sandwiches, apples filled the air. At each stop, more boarded, carrying flags, banners, and stories of why they had to be there. No one knew for sure what would happen when they all arrived. Would they be heard or ignored? Would the government respond with force? But a shared belief rippled from one person to the next. If enough of them stood together in Washington, the long silence would finally break. And so, amid the roll of wheels, the singing, the laughter and nerves, the road to Washington took shape. Not only on a map, but in the hearts of hundreds of thousands moving toward a day that would enter history. If the March of August 28, 1963, was a grand crescendo echoing before the Lincoln Memorial, then the months that came before it were the quiet but determined orchestra. A layered composition where every instrument, every person, every organization, every path had to keep perfect time. Miss a single note, and the entire performance could unravel into chaos. At the center of this orchestration stood A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin. Randolph, then 74, was among the most revered elders of the civil rights movement, longtime leader of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. He was tall, with a deep and unhurried voice, and a calm presence that made people listen. He was not impulsive. He had been nurturing the idea of a march on Washington since the 1940s, and now he knew the time had ripened. Beside him was Bayard Rustin, a strategist, an organizer with a computer-like memory and the persistence of a mountain climber. Rustin had studied nonviolence from Gandhi's students in India, had been jailed for opposing war, and had helped coordinate the earliest freedom rides. He didn't carry Randolph's quiet authority, but he had the gift of turning ideas into to-do lists, and those lists into action. The two were like a pair of architects. Randolph drew the vision, and Rustin raised the pillars, strung the wires, and built the stage. The problem was, the vision was nearly impossible. They aimed to bring over 100,000 people, and in the end, nearly twice that, to the nation's capital, in the middle of summer, to gather, to march, and to return home safely. No violence, no chaos, no single act that could be twisted to discredit the movement. Logistics were a lurking nightmare. Transportation. Buses from the South had to travel thousands of miles through states still thick with racial tension, where harassment was a real risk. Special trains had to be arranged for crowds from Chicago, Detroit, and New York. Food and water. In the middle of the National Mall, hundreds of thousands could not be left parched under the August sun. Trucks were hired to haul ice, and water stations were set up across the area. Sound. The speeches, kings among them, had to reach the farthest edge of the crowd. A sound system had to cover more than a mile, in an era without modern wireless tech. Toilets. An unromantic but essential detail, hundreds of portable toilets were installed across the mall and along the march route. Medical. Volunteer doctors and nurses were stationed in first aid tents. They prepared for heat stroke, fainting, even injury, just in case. Rustin drafted detailed maps. He marked every speaker, every medical post, every path in and out. Every detail was accounted for, where people would receive their programs, how incoming buses would be directed once they arrived in D.C., and logistics were only half the battle. The political coordination was its own labyrinth. 6 major civil rights organizations, known as the Big Six, were involved, each with its own style and priorities. SCLC, led by Martin Luther King Jr., focused on nonviolence and grassroots campaigns. NAACP, under Roy Wilkins, was strong in legal work and lobbying. SNCC, led by John Lewis, was young, radical, and often impatient with slow change. CORE, founded by James Farmer, was known for its Freedom Ride campaigns. Urban League, led by Whitney Young, emphasized jobs and economic advancement. And Randolph's own Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which tied the civil rights cause to the labor movement. Each group brought its own methods, its own resources, and its own pride. Rustin became the translator between them, seeking common ground and smoothing over differences. A speech too radical might offend the NAACP. A program too moderate could leave SNCC feeling sidelined. Meetings in New York and Washington stretched for hours, rooms thick with cigarette smoke, tables cluttered with coffee cups and papers. Randolph, calm and steady, would return to the theme of unity. Rustin stood by the board, ticking off tasks, setting deadlines. They both knew, if this failed, it would not just be an unfinished event. It would be a stain. Proof in the eyes of their opponents that they can't organize themselves. Beyond the leaders, hundreds of volunteers were the movement's quiet engine. They knocked on church doors, mailed flyers to community groups, called every union. They raised donations, sold March on Washington buttons, printed posters. Every dollar, every bus ticket, became a brick on the road to August 28th. The work took place in a mood of tension and resolve. On Rustin's desk, maps and contact sheets piled high. In Randolph's pocket, a small piece of paper with a few words that kept his focus steady. Jobs and freedom. As August approached, the federal government kept close watch. The FBI planted informants among volunteers, searching for proof of communist influence or plans for violence. Rustin knew this, but he had no time to worry. He simply reminded the team, "We let no one sabotage this. Everything must be on time. Everything must go to plan." And then, in the final days before the march, the first buses began to roll. The first trains began to depart. Across the country, tens of thousands left home, with packed lunches, water jugs, handmade signs, and the belief that they were heading toward a moment that could shift the course of history. In Rustin's mind, the checklist was still unfinished. In Randolph's heart, the flame that had burned for 2 decades now blazed bright. What once seemed impossible was drawing near. And as the wheels turned toward the capital, Washington, D.C. prepared to receive a day unlike any it had ever seen. That morning, Washington, D.C. woke to the pale light of late August. The sun had not yet risen high, but the heat was already enough to make shirts cling to the backs of those walking from bus stops toward the National Mall. The fresh air of early day mingled with the smell of gasoline from idling engines and the damp scent of grass stretching from the Lincoln Memorial to the Washington Monument. From early on, voices had begun to rise in song. Near the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, a group of gospel singers in white robes lifted "We Shall Overcome," not loud, but deep and full, like a vow. Along the walkways, people passed out black and white programs, a list of speakers, a schedule, and the bold headline, "March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom." If you had stood in the crowd at that moment, every sense would have been busy, your eyes catching glimpses of American flags woven between handmade signs. End segregation now. Jobs for all. We want freedom. Your ears filled with footsteps, conversation, the clapping of strangers greeting each other. Your nose taking in the scent of sunscreen, fried chicken sandwiches from picnic baskets, and the sweat of long journeys from distant states. The crowds kept coming. They arrived from everywhere. Teachers from Chicago, factory workers from Detroit, farmers from Mississippi, students from northern colleges. Even famous faces, Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Marlon Brando, faded into the larger current of people moving as one. The music never stopped. An acoustic guitar carried the young voice of Joan Baez. A harmonica slipped between blues lines sung by a group from New Orleans. Some tapped tambourines to the rhythm, others clapped along. The air felt festive, but underneath pulsed the quiet understanding that every footstep, every note, was being recorded in the living memory of history. Speakers began to take the stage, from seasoned leaders like A. Philip Randolph and Roy Wilkins to young voices like John Lewis, only 23 at the time. Lewis, speaking for SNCC, had originally prepared a far fiercer speech, but softened it after being urged that his words might fracture the unity of the day. Still, his message remained firm, that black youth would not wait forever for justice. Between speeches, Mahalia Jackson's voice rang out like a church bell, carried through loudspeakers to the very edges of the reflecting pool. Her song was both a prayer and a push forward. In the crowd, small stories unfolded beside the grand ones. A middle-aged woman from Georgia stood beside a white student from Wisconsin. They first exchanged a bottle of water, then began talking, comparing the differences between their hometowns. A World War II veteran stood silently, holding a photograph of his son, recently killed in an act of racial violence, eyes fixed on the podium ahead. A cluster of children sat on their parents' shoulders, eyes wide as the chants of "Freedom Now" echoed above them. Step away from the main area, and you'd find quieter corners, medical tents with long lines of people drinking water and resting in the shade. Volunteers in white shirts guiding the flow of the crowd. Journalists hunched over typewriters in the makeshift press area. There were no social media feeds, no instant updates, only phone lines, radios, and film cameras. And then, by mid-afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows across the grass, Martin Luther King Jr. stepped onto the podium. He wore a dark suit and a neatly tied tie, and at first read from the speech he had prepared. But from behind him, Mahalia Jackson called out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." King looked up, set the script aside, and began to speak of a dream, his dream of a just America, where children would not be judged by the color of their skin, where descendants of slaves and of slave owners could sit at the same table. His voice was deep but clear, each line beating like the slow, steady pulse of the crowd itself. And when he ended with, "Free at last! Free at last! Thank God Almighty, we are free at last!" the roar of voices rose like a wave, swept across the reflecting pool, and crashed against the stone walls of the Lincoln Memorial. But those who were there did not only remember what King said. They remembered standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers, drawn together by purpose. They remembered the songs that filled the morning. They remembered the unfamiliar hand that found theirs when the applause began. They remembered the moment they knew, truly knew, that they were part of something larger than themselves. A day they would speak of to their grandchildren, decades later, beginning with the simple words, "I was there." August 28, 1963, is remembered not just for the speeches on the stage, but for the hundreds of thousands of quieter stories lived beneath the sun that day, stories rarely written down, but threads that wove the fabric of history. When Martin Luther King Jr. stepped up to the podium on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial that afternoon of August 28, 1963, the Washington sky had already softened. The noonday sun had begun to retreat, leaving long ribbons of shade stretching across the reflecting pool. A light breeze moved through the air, rustling flags and banners that read, "Jobs and Freedom." Beneath him stood a sea of people, hundreds of thousands of faces, each one carrying a story, each one holding a reason to be there. King held in his hands a prepared manuscript, a typewritten speech, revised and marked with underlines and margin notes. It had been carefully crafted in collaboration with his colleagues at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He planned to speak about America's promissory note to black citizens, a check that had come back marked insufficient funds from the vaults of justice. His voice was low and steady at the start, each phrase chosen with care, each metaphor placed with purpose. He spoke of a nation that had not kept its promise, of the sweltering summer of discontent that must be transformed into an autumn of freedom and equality. Those closest nodded quietly. Those farther out listened through loudspeakers, the sound carrying across the water, blending with the soft rustle of flags and clothing in the wind. But then a moment, small but defining. King looked up toward the chairs behind him. There sat Mahalia Jackson, the legendary gospel singer who had performed earlier. She leaned forward and called out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." King had spoken about that dream before, in churches, at smaller rallies. But it wasn't in the prepared script. It wasn't part of today's official plan. Her call rang like a bell struck at the right instant. He paused, set the speech aside. And then his voice shifted, less measured, more alive with the rhythm of the pulpit. Each line now began with, "I have a dream," each one like a drumbeat, pulling the crowd into a living vision. "I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day my 4 little children will live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." With every line, his voice rose, like a wave gaining strength. The crowd responded, "Yes," and "Amen," rising from clusters near the stage and rippling outward. People clapped in rhythm. Some shook their heads slowly, trying to fix each word into memory. In that moment, King was not just a political speaker. He was a preacher addressing a vast congregation. And that congregation extended far beyond the National Mall. It reached living rooms across the country through radio and television. His words were no longer points in an argument. They had become a vision, a picture of what could be. And the power of "I have a dream" didn't lie in novelty. Others had dreamed of a just society before. But King gave that dream a moment, standing before Lincoln's statue, 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, in front of a sea of people searching for hope. He turned a private longing into a shared prayer. In the craft of oratory, some passages are remembered for their technique, others for their timing. "I have a dream" was both. Its repetition created a gentle trance, enough to let listeners sense the rhythm, yet still crave the next image. And those images, the red hills of Georgia, the table of brotherhood, the children hand in hand, made the future feel visible, tangible, near. As he reached the climax, King wove his dream into the song, "My Country, 'Tis of Thee," naming mountaintops and valleys across America. His voice swept the country into one unified vision, a land and a people joined in a single hymn of freedom. And then, the closing lines, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last." The cheers exploded, applause thundered. There was no longer a boundary between stage and crowd. People cried, laughed, embraced. They raised their flags and signs into the air. The moment became a crossing point, where joy met relief and the quiet realization settled in. They had just witnessed something that would be remembered for generations. Years later, many who were there would admit they didn't recall the whole speech, but they remembered "I have a dream." Not just the words, but the goosebumps, the way a stranger beside them looked, the shared understanding that they had lived inside a sliver of history. That is the power of language, to turn lines on paper into movement, to turn a summer afternoon into an immortal symbol. And in that moment, Martin Luther King Jr. did what no plan, no script could guarantee. He reached into the hearts of millions, all at once. If you look only at the photographs from August 28, 1963, hundreds of thousands standing shoulder to shoulder, flags waving, voices lifted in song across the National Mall. You might believe this was a moment when every fracture in the civil rights movement vanished. A perfect unity, one voice, one vision, one purpose. But step outside the frame and rewind the months leading up to that day, and the picture becomes far less seamless. The 6 major organizations, known as the Big Six, each carried their own histories, their own strategies, and their own egos. Roy Wilkins' NAACP focused on legal battles and lobbying. They favored a moderate message, careful not to alienate white lawmakers. John Lewis's SNCC was youthful, fiery, demanding immediate change, unafraid to name brutality with sharp language. James Farmer's core was shaped by direct action and the confrontational grit of the Freedom Rides. Martin Luther King Jr.'s SCLC was the public face of nonviolence, but also under pressure to maintain white middle-class support. During planning, John Lewis had drafted a speech that harshly criticized the Kennedy administration and the weakness of its civil rights bill. It was deemed too inflammatory by older leaders who feared it would fracture the spirit of unity. Only hours before Lewis took the stage, the speech was revised. He agreed, but many within SNCC walked away with a quiet ache, the feeling of having been reined in. One thing rarely mentioned in official accounts is the immense role women played. and the silence they were met with on the podium. Ella Baker, Diane Nash, Septima Clark, Dorothy Height. These were the architects of networks, training grounds, and protest campaigns. And yet on that day, not one woman spoke in her own name. Rosa Parks, whose quiet defiance sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, was honored with a seat near the stage, but not a microphone. Dorothy Height, head of the National Council of Negro Women, was left off the speaker's list entirely, despite her organizing role. Only Daisy Bates spoke briefly, a short message on behalf of the women who have fought for freedom. And even then, she had just a few minutes. Behind the scenes, it left a quiet scar. A movement that called for racial equality had not yet begun to wrestle with gender equality. Beneath the celebratory air and disciplined nonviolence, the shadow of the FBI loomed. J. Edgar Hoover had long viewed Martin Luther King Jr. and civil rights leaders as a threat to national security. From the moment the march was announced, the FBI embedded informants in volunteer teams, monitored meetings, wiretapped phones. They paid particular attention to Bayard Rustin, the architect of the march. Rustin was openly gay and had past ties to leftist groups during the Cold War. Hoover believed that exposing Rustin could discredit the entire event. Leaders had to balance protecting Rustin and protecting the march. On the day itself, dozens of plainclothes agents were scattered through the crowd, cameras at the ready. Some were tasked with recording bus license plates, zooming in on the faces of attendees. It was a cold truth. As marchers dreamed of freedom, the government they petitioned spent its resources watching them. On the surface, the event went smoothly. No violence, no chaos. But in the days before, tensions were real. Leaders feared provocation, that extremists might infiltrate to cause disruption, that police might overreact. Organizers trained hundreds of marshals, volunteer peacekeepers, to guide the crowd and step in if tensions rose. Wearing white shirts and armbands, they moved in small groups, watching for signs of trouble. They were a soft barrier against dangers no one could predict. There were private fears, too. Some attendees from the South carried memories of beatings, of homes burned down. They were not sure the Capitol would be safe. One couple from Alabama said they wrote their wills before boarding the bus. Just in case, they didn't return. The next day's headlines called it historic, an extraordinary display of discipline. They weren't wrong, but in many hearts, another question had already begun to form. What happens tomorrow? Many young activists felt the message had been softened for television. The stronger anti-segregation slogans were left aside. Concrete demands, minimum wage increases, labor reform, had been overshadowed by broader moral appeals. To them, the march was a victory in optics, but not necessarily in substance. And if the overhead photos showed a sea of people, at the edge of the frame were those who couldn't be there, those in the South who were threatened with job loss if they asked for the day off. Those in jail, arrested during earlier protests. Those newly arrived in northern cities, without the money or documents to leave town. They weren't present, but their stories were still part of the movement. In churches and crowded living rooms, they listened on the radio, imagining themselves standing under Lincoln's gaze, hearing "I have a dream" as if spoken directly to them. That day, the world saw a united movement. But within, there were arguments, compromises, and quiet omissions. And maybe it's that complexity that makes the story real. The civil rights movement was not a solid block, but a loose alliance, constantly negotiating between ideals and reality, between unity and difference. And though it had its moment of harmony, the story was far from over. The afternoon of August 28, 1963, closed with a sea of people quietly dispersing. Signs were folded away. Songs still lingered in the grass. As darkness settled over Washington, D.C., the story left the wide-open plaza and entered conference rooms, newsrooms, and the long corridors of power. At the White House, President John F. Kennedy had watched most of the march on television. Just months earlier, he had voiced concerns that hundreds of thousands descending on the Capitol might spark unrest or create an image damaging to the civil rights bill stalled in Congress. But when the event unfolded peacefully, and when Martin Luther King Jr. ended with the cry, "Free at last," the mood in the Oval Office softened. Kennedy smiled, called in a few aides, and said simply, "Impressive." That evening, he invited civil rights leaders to the White House. Photographs of him shaking hands with King and A. Philip Randolph appeared in newspapers the next day, a quiet signal that the White House was, at least for now, open to the movement. In Congress, the response was less unified. Many Northern legislators praised the march as living proof of nonviolence's power. But Southern senators, who still held sway over key committees, reacted harshly. They called it a staged performance, a form of street pressure on legislative process. Some revived old accusations that the movement was infiltrated by communists, offering no proof, but enough to stir doubt and delay. The next day's press was flooded with images from the mall. Overhead shots showed a vast crowd pressed together under blue skies. The New York Times called it a historic moment in American life. The Washington Post emphasized the remarkable discipline of the marchers. But not every outlet agreed. Some Southern papers ran editorials warning that excessive demands would backfire. Television, taking center stage for the first time, beamed the peaceful, multiracial images into millions of living rooms, quietly dismantling many myths about protest. Among black communities, especially in northern cities, the day after carried a strange, glowing air. People gathered in churches, diners, storefronts, talking about King's speech, about the crowd beneath Lincoln's gaze. For many, it was the first time they had seen the movement reflected on a national scale. In the South, the reaction was more tangled. There was hope, but also anxiety about backlash. And just weeks later, the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham would kill 4 young black girls, bringing everyone back to the brutal present. For movement leaders, the march was a launch pad, not a landing. King used the media spotlight to press the civil rights bill forward. Randolph and Rustin kept repeating the message of jobs and freedom, insisting that economic justice stand beside civil rights. They knew the emotions would fade unless turned into political pressure. In the following weeks came meetings, lobbying, and media campaigns, efforts to keep the fire lit. In private conversations, many admitted the march, while successful, had not immediately shifted power. Jim Crow laws still stood. Congress was still fractured. Unemployment and poverty still bore down. Its greatest success, perhaps, was the image. Proof that hundreds of thousands could demand justice without shattering a single window. In an era where television shaped public opinion, that was a strategic victory. Looking back now, the government and media's reaction in 1963 reminds us of an old truth, that moments of bright unity are often tested by the cold waters of politics. A speech may stir hearts, but to change laws requires another fight, longer, less glamorous, rarely televised. The march had pushed the ball into Congress's court. But everyone knew the road from feeling to policy is uneven, and only persistence could carry the dream further. After the summer march of 1963, the nation's attention shifted to the corridors of Congress, where the Civil Rights Bill, introduced by Kennedy in June, had stalled in committees controlled by Southern lawmakers. The image of hundreds of thousands gathered before Lincoln, the echo of "I have a dream" and pressure from advocacy groups had created a new urgency, but not enough to break the legislative wall. Kennedy knew he needed the support of a deeply divided Congress. That fall, he began a quiet campaign of meeting senators one by one, trying to persuade them. Then, in November 1963, everything changed. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Lyndon B. Johnson took office, bringing years of Senate leadership and a far more forceful political style. In the early days of his presidency, Johnson vowed to do everything in his power to pass the Civil Rights Bill, framing it as a way to honor Kennedy's legacy. He deployed every tool in his political arsenal: lobbying, backroom pressure, promises, and strategic bargaining. He leaned hard where he had to. In the Senate, Southern Democrats, led by Richard Russell, Strom Thurmond, and Robert Byrd, launched a filibuster. For weeks, they stalled the vote by reading speeches into the night. At its peak, Byrd spoke for 14 hours straight. But in June 1964, a rare coalition of Northern Democrats and moderate Republicans broke the filibuster, a rare and historic feat. And on July 2, 1964, Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law. The legislation outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in public places, in the workplace, and in any program receiving federal funding. It empowered the federal government to enforce school and business integration. For the civil rights movement, it was the most significant legal win since the end of the Civil War. But in many southern states, the law was met with resistance, quiet and open. Some localities delayed enforcement. Others looked for legal loopholes or relied on violence to maintain the old order. Despite the progress, one core issue remained unresolved: voting rights. In many southern counties, Black Americans were still kept from the ballot box through literacy tests, poll taxes, or the threat of physical harm. Events in places like Selma, Alabama, exposed the brutality of this system. In March 1965, police attacked peaceful marchers demanding voting rights. The images from Bloody Sunday, protesters beaten with clubs, tear-gassed on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, were broadcast nationwide, igniting outrage. Johnson, ever the political tactician, recognized the moment. He delivered a powerful message to Congress, echoing the movement's own words: "We shall overcome." In August 1965, the Voting Rights Act became law. It banned all discriminatory practices in voting, eliminated literacy tests, and gave the federal government the authority to oversee voter registration in areas with histories of suppression. These two laws, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, were the high points of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. They transformed many of the demands from the 1963 march into legal reality, expanding freedom and equality, on paper, for millions of Americans. But with victory came limits. Laws could change rules. They could not instantly change hearts, habits, or the deeper structures of society. Racism remained, now in subtler forms, embedded in housing, employment, and law enforcement. Many activists realized the movement needed to evolve. Some shifted focus toward economic justice, fighting poverty, pushing for job access. Others, especially younger generations, grew impatient with the slow pace of progress and turned to stronger voices, like Malcolm X or the messages of Black Power. The unity that once powered the 1963 march now faced a new challenge. What comes next? In hindsight, the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts were built on years of sacrifice, protest, and strategic effort. They proved that pressure from the streets, when sustained and paired with political skill, could move even the most immovable walls. But they also served as a reminder: Legal victories are not destinations. They are mile markers on a far longer road that demands not just policy, but a transformation of the human heart. After the summer of 1963, the images from the March on Washington echoed far beyond the borders of the United States. They spread across the world, front pages in Europe, Africa, Asia, and Latin America. In Paris, London, and Rome, photographs of Martin Luther King Jr. standing before the Lincoln Memorial and of the tightly packed crowds along the reflecting pool appeared beneath headlines calling it a turning point in American democracy. To many abroad, America was no longer only an economic and military superpower. It was a nation publicly wrestling with its own contradictions. In Africa, where many countries had recently gained independence from European colonial powers, the American civil rights movement became a reference point. Leaders in Ghana, Nigeria, Tanzania, and elsewhere saw in the march a demonstration that non-violence could unite the masses and apply pressure to power. Some African journalists wrote candidly that the treatment of Black Americans was the true test of the democratic promises Washington exported around the globe. In South Africa, under the tightening grip of apartheid, news of "I Have a Dream" slipped past censorship barriers and stirred hope among both open activists and those working in secret. The context was different, but the idea of a society not defined by skin color carried undeniable weight. Some activists later recalled copying the speech by hand or memorizing entire passages to recite to one another. Across Asia, the American civil rights struggle was followed alongside anti-colonial campaigns and emerging democratic movements. In India, the press drew direct lines between King and Gandhi, viewing it as a continuation of the spirit of nonviolence. In Japan and South Korea, social justice advocates cited Washington 1963 as proof that peaceful protest could resonate across borders. In Latin America, where many nations lived under military rule or political unrest, the march became a subject of discussion among student groups and intellectuals. Though their circumstances differed, the call for equality and freedom struck a chord. A reminder that popular movements could compel governments to listen. Artists, musicians, and playwrights in Brazil, Chile, and Argentina drew inspiration from Washington to create songs, performances, and murals filled with resistance. Its global impact wasn't just about content, but also about form. The world witnessed hundreds of thousands gather without disorder, a level of discipline hard to imagine in many nations where protest was viewed solely as a threat. This placed the U.S. in a complicated light, criticized for its racial injustices, yet praised for allowing its citizens to speak out peacefully. In the Cold War context, those images became part of the soft competition, a chance for America to present itself as a society capable of self-correction, even if that correction came painfully and slowly. But the long shadow of 1963 brought with it new pressures and new expectations. Human rights movements elsewhere began to look to America for both inspiration and comparison. When the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act were passed, many around the world took it as proof that change was possible. But they also saw the cost: centuries of struggle, thousands of lives. Even in an old democracy, it had taken that long to reach such milestones. In the years that followed, the images and words of Washington 1963 continued to surface in places no one could have predicted, in protests against authoritarian regimes in Eastern Europe, in speeches at the United Nations, in meeting rooms of human rights organizations. "I Have a Dream" became a kind of global refrain, often quoted without its full context, but still carrying immense emotional force. That shadow also fell on the civil rights movement itself. As new challenges emerged, the Vietnam War, economic inequality, some activists felt trapped beneath the expectation to recreate the clarity and unity of that one day in 1963. But history does not often repeat by script. That march had been the result of a rare convergence of time, of people, of circumstance, a convergence not easily replicated. Looking beyond borders, 1963 left a double legacy. It proved the power of mass gatherings and non-violence, but it also showed that even the most visible victories take decades to reach daily life. That moment became part of humanity's shared memory, a testament to will, to possibility, but also a reminder. The road from a speech to a just reality is always longer than the stage allows us to see. More than half a century has passed since that summer of 1963, when hundreds of thousands stood before the Lincoln Memorial to hear Martin Luther King Jr. speak of a dream. On paper, much of what the civil rights movement fought for has become law. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 dismantled the legal foundation of institutionalized racial discrimination. Segregation in schools, restaurants, hotels, and workplaces was banned. Black Americans, along with other minority groups, were granted protected voting rights. And from city councils to Congress, from courtrooms to the White House, faces that once seemed unimaginable in 1963 began to appear. Barack Obama became the 44th president, a global symbol of possibility and change. But if we look only at laws and prominent figures, the picture leaves out many of its shadows. Economic gaps between Black and white Americans persist. Rates of poverty, unemployment, and lack of health insurance remain higher in Black communities than the national average. Housing systems still reflect the legacy of redlining. Neighborhoods once marked in red now often remain underinvested, with struggling schools and limited job access. The justice system, from policing to incarceration, continues to reveal stark disparities. Black Americans are more likely to be arrested, charged, and sentenced to prison than others, even when committing similar offenses. In recent years, police violence against Black individuals, from Ferguson to Minneapolis, has ignited fresh waves of protest. The phrase "Black Lives Matter" has become a defining cry of the modern era. And in those marches, the images and words of Washington 1963 reappear, but now mingled with both frustration and resolve. On voting rights, though the 1965 Act opened the doors to the ballot box, recent decades have seen those doors begin to narrow again. Some states have introduced strict ID requirements, reduced early voting sites, or redrawn districts in ways that dilute Black voting power. In 2013, the Supreme Court struck down a key provision of the Act, ending federal oversight in areas with a history of voter suppression. Barriers quickly resurfaced. Many advocacy groups have called it a profound setback. The diversity seen today in politics and culture is significant, but it does not equate to full equality. The success of a few Black individuals does not erase the reality that opportunity remains unevenly distributed. A Black student in a low-income neighborhood is still less likely to attend college than a peer from a wealthier zip code. A middle-class Black family still holds significantly less generational wealth than a white family with the same income. These disparities are no longer enshrined in law, as they were before 1964, but they persist as the compounded legacy of generations of inequality. King's dream also envisioned a society of brotherhood, where people are not judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. In some spaces, we have come closer to that vision, in classrooms, offices, and communities where relationships stretch beyond race. But at a national level, political polarization and racial tension still run deep. Debates over the legacy of slavery, monuments, and how history is taught reveal that America has yet to reach a shared understanding of its past, and without that, reconciliation remains elusive. If you ask whether the dream has come true, the answer depends on who you ask. Some see undeniable progress. A younger generation raised in diverse environments, broader access to opportunity, and laws that prohibit open discrimination. Others see a dream deferred. Gains that are fragile, progress constantly at risk of being reversed. Perhaps the truth lies in between. The dream has gone further than ever before, and yet it remains incomplete. And maybe, like all great dreams, it was never meant to be a fixed destination, but a direction, a guiding star. It reminds us that victories do not sustain themselves, and the distance that remains will not close on its own. The road from Washington 1963 to now tells us that each generation must ask the same question again and find its own answer. When we stitch together these three seemingly separate journeys, a larger picture begins to form. The sleeping nights of medieval Europe, with dry straw, nightcaps, insect chatter, and the warmth of other bodies, reveal how people carved out order amid scarcity, cold, and danger. Sleep, in that world, was not just rest. It was a survival strategy. In every detail, from the splitting of the night into two phases, to the covering of heads while sleeping, there were quiet lessons in adaptation, even if the cost was comfort, privacy, or sometimes safety. The story of Fulvia, a woman who stepped into the political arena of Rome and refused to stand aside while power shifted, shows us a different kind of existence, the boldness of breaking through the boundaries society imposes, and the cost of doing so. She wielded marriage, alliances, even war to preserve her influence. But in the end, she was pushed to the margins when the structures of power made no space for her. In Rome, Fulvia's cunning and resolve were a double-edged sword. They carried her to the heights, but also to isolation. And official history recorded her name not as a triumph, but as a warning. The 1963 March on Washington, with its sea of silence and echoing speech, offers yet another fragment. The power of collective presence and disciplined unity when individuals turn toward a single shared purpose. It proved that change can begin in a day, in a moment, but to endure, it must be extended through law, through strategy, through persistence. The march achieved real victories, but the long shadow it cast reminds us, no triumph is immune to time's erosion, or to waves of resistance that follow. 3 stories, 3 contexts, 3 ways people confront limits, of nature, of society, of power. Different in method, but all speak to the same truth. Change demands a price, and that price is rarely paid equally. Some adapt to survive, some risk everything to break through. Some come together to exert collective pressure, but none escape the consequences of those choices. And so, looking back, the question is not only, what did they do? But also, what will we do? In a world once again filled with uncertainty, where new boundaries emerge and once settled rights grow shaky, will we choose to sleep soundly in the beds already made, or accept the cost of reshaping them? Will we step into spaces of power that were not designed for us, or find a common square where we can raise our voices together? And when the moment comes, will we have the patience to turn it into a journey? Which path will you choose? You've just walked through a medieval night with a nightcap and a fading fire, through Roman corridors with the footsteps of Fulvia, and through the summer of 1963 with the songs rising before the Lincoln Memorial. 3 stories, 3 eras, 3 ways people have faced limits, of the body, of society, of power. Maybe you heard them as lessons, or maybe just as the quiet background of a sleepy historian. Maybe you came here searching for history to fall asleep, or simply because you enjoy the feeling that boring history for sleep brings. A slow rhythm, long enough to make tonight softer. If you're still awake, leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. And if you've fallen asleep, that's fine too. That's what these stories are for. I'll see you in the next journey, when we open another page of history for sleeping together.